فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So for today, I want to continue with Surat Maryam, or the chapter of Mary, and speak about when she goes back to her people. So in verse 27, we reach a climax. So as we discussed in previous episodes, Maryam has now the baby. She has Jesus, but she's told to enjoy herself, to eat, drink, and if she sees anyone, she should take a vow of silence, that she shouldn't speak to anyone. Now, this creates an interesting problem for Maryam, that if she takes this vow of silence, she will not be able to respond. She will not be able to defend herself against accusations, and she will be someone who will be a target because she's known in her community as not being married. She is single, and if she comes back with a child, she'd be accused of infidelity, of adultery, and fornication, and she would be someone that would be outcasted and potentially a pariah. So the Quran says, so she went back to her people carrying the child, and they said, Mary, you have done something terrible. So as the Arabic says, فَأَتَتْ بِهِ قَوْمَهَا تَحْمِلُ. So she went back to her people, and she is carrying him. قَالُوا يَا مَرْيَمْ لَقَدْ جِئْتِ شَيْئًا فَرِيًّا. And they said to her, oh Maryam, or Mary, you have done something that is horrible. Now, a couple of things stand out in this particular verse. First off, we see that she comes back to her people. So this is constantly used in the Quran, that the various prophets, the righteous people, they have a people that they go back to, a nation, a tribe, and she is part of this community. Now, of course, people, a community, a nation can be supportive. They provide you with nourishment, sustenance. They also provide emotional support, but they also can be judgmental and they can also be critical. And there are certain codes and morals that keep that community together. Now, this is supposedly or understood to be a religious community, a community of Jews, of rabbis. She comes from a religious family, and now all of a sudden she is doing or is accused of doing something that would be unimaginable. Someone coming from a priestly family having a child out of wedlock. Now, the other thing that strikes me in this verse is this verb tahmilu, or the idea of carrying. Now, she is literally carrying her child, and Jesus in particular, to her people. And the Arabic is fascinating that it says that she is carrying him. So Jesus is not even mentioned in the verse, but only in the sense of a pronoun. So once again, Maryam is seen as a protagonist. She's carrying her child, not necessarily carrying Jesus. Of course, Jesus is that child, but it's mentioned that it's Maryam who is the one that is carrying. Now, this verb comes or appears several times throughout the chapter Maryam. So if we go back just a couple of verses, in verse 22, it says فَحَمَلَتْهُ فَانْتَبَذَتْ بِهِ مَكَانًا قَصِيًّا. So if we recall that Maryam, when she was approached by the angel Jibril, that she was told that she was going to have a child. And then she questioned, how is this possible when no man has touched me? And then angel Gabriel said, this is an affair and an order from God. So the Quran then says that she became pregnant, and she literally started carrying the child, and she separated herself in a distant place. Now, one of the things in Arabic is always interesting, and studying different languages is something I enjoy doing, is that you understand how different concepts or ideas are expressed. And in the Arabic language, when someone is pregnant, they're literally called hamil, or they're someone who is carrying. So in English, we may say someone is pregnant, that they've been impregnated, right? So a sperm has pregnated an egg, and now a child is growing. But here we see in the Arabic language the idea of actually carrying a child. So it's not about pregnation, but it's more about the acts of carrying a life. And here the Quran says فَحَمَلَتْهُ, that she actually started to carry, or she became pregnant, and then she started to withdraw from her people. Now this verse has this idea that Maryam began to show that she eventually, as someone becomes pregnant, people start noticing and they may become curious and start asking. So part of the reason why she withdrew from her people is that they wouldn't be aware of her pregnancy, or in some ways she was trying to hide that she was pregnant. Now, this verb also appears in other parts of Surat Maryam. So if we go to a couple of verses later, in verse 58, there is this idea of hamil, or carrying, with that of Noah, of Nuh. أولئك الذين أنعم الله عليهم من النبيين من ذرية آدم وممن حملنا مع نوح. So here we see this fascinating verse that after we speak about Zechariah, we speak about Zechariah, about Maryam and Isa, Mary and Jesus, that we come to a section of the chapter of Mary, of Maryam. And in this section, it talks about the different prophets. Now, this section in the chapter of Maryam is often ignored, that most scholars focus on the beginning, especially the verses on Mary, Maryam. But there's been some really recent fascinating research that talks about how these verses are connected to earlier ones, and there's certain echoes. So some of the words that we see used earlier to talk about Zechariah or Zechariah or Maryam, Mary, are also used to talk about the other prophets. So we see here that the verb hamala is also used to talk about Noah, or Noah, and him carrying the ark. So this verse says, and to those people that God has blessed, that he's given them prophets among their progeny, and the people who were carried with Noah. So the idea here is that the ark of Noah, literally carried the progeny of humanity and carry them to safety. So we see that there is this echo or parallel here between the idea of Mary carrying her son, Jesus, Isa, first in her belly. Then the child emerges and is born, and the labor is complete. But then Mary, Maryam, she carries Isa, Jesus, to her people. And this seems to be a type of parallel with that of Noah. Then Noah, in some ways, carried his people away from the flood and to redemption and rescue. So there is this potential parallel that just as Mary, Maryam, is carrying Isa, Nuh was carried by God to redemption. And then it continues and it speaks about the idea of Abraham and Israel being among the progeny, that they were guided, and that God chose them. And he recited his verses upon them, and they went down in prostration and crying. Lastly, what we see in this verse is the idea that Maryam is an object of attack. And this is common even today, that many women are often held to a double standard, especially when it comes to sexual morals. When men sleep around, for instance, they may not be judged as hardly, they may not be punished. But a woman, for instance, when she is accused of infidelity or adultery or fornication, then there's a harsher judgment. And also the evidence, right? The evidence of a child out of wedlock is more apparent with a woman, that a man can say, dissociate himself and say, I was not involved. But at the end of the day, the woman is the one who becomes pregnant, and she begins to show, and she ends up having the child. And scholars have noted this in this verse, that Zechariah is never questioned, right? So if you go earlier, Zechariah also asks for a child. He's given a child, but none of his people actually go to him and criticize him. And none of them say, hey, you've done something that is wrong. And how can you have a child when you're old and you're barren? And also there is a sense that Zechariah has a child with his wife, who he is married to. Now, there seems to be a harsher judgment to that of Maryam, that Maryam is not married here, but she does have a child and she goes back to her people. And scholars have noted this in the Quran itself, that it speaks about or defends women who are accused of infidelity and adultery. For instance, in the famous story of the Hadith al-Ifk, or the Great Lie, that Aisha, that the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, was also accused of infidelity, of adultery, but then the Quran comes down and defends her and say that she did not engage in this particular act. So scholars have seen a parallel here between Maryam and that of Aisha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad. And they see this parallel in the sense that Maryam was accused of infidelity, but then God defended her through the words of Jesus. And in a similar way, Aisha was accused of infidelity and adultery and not being loyal to the Prophet Muhammad, but then the Quranic revelation comes down and defends her. And we also see that similar language is actually used in both of the stories, and they are used to defend Maryam and that of Aisha. So if we look at the verse that speaks about the story of the lie, the Quranic revelation says, أن نتكلم بهذا سبحانك هذا بهتان عظيم, that it says, how can we speak about such a thing? Glory be to you, O Lord, this is a heinous slander. So it speaks about this idea of buhtan azim, that this is a great or heinous slander that was committed, that people started spreading rumors about Aisha and saying that she did something that she did not do. And it's fascinating that this exact phrase is used to speak about Maryam. So if you look in the chapter of the women, وَبِكُفْرِهِمْ وَقَوْلِهِمْ عَلَى مَرْيَمْ بُهْتَانٍ عَظِيمًا. So on their disbelief, on their saying on Mary, Maryam, is a heinous slander. The same phrase, buhtan al-azima. So this idea that people accuse Maryam of having a child out of wedlock, of committing fornication and potentially adultery, that she was in a similar position to that of Aisha. But God defends both of them, whether that be in the Quran or through the words of Jesus. So in conclusion, we see in this particular verse this fear emerge, that Maryam is coming back to her people, and in many ways she is afraid. She's afraid of her community, their judgment, their accusations against her, and she comes and she's literally carrying her child. And one of the things I love about the way the Arabic language describes pregnancy is that when someone's carrying their child, it does represent the idea of struggle, of pain even, that carrying a life for 9 months is not easy. And there's pain, there could be even suffering, but there can also be immense joy when that child is born. We also see that these verses speak about accusations, about criticisms. And we see that there are many verses in the Quran that talk about the criticisms leveled against the Prophet Muhammad, against the early Muslim community. And in many ways, Maryam is someone they looked up to, that they modeled themselves after. And they understood that Maryam was also attacked for her revelations and for her piety. And they saw solace in Maryam and her example. And that they understood that she went through difficult criticisms and accusations, but she was able to move forward and to redeem herself. We also see that in the Quran and in this particular story, that when people attack the righteous and when they attack biblical and Quranic figures, this leads to eventual defense. That yes, Maryam is attacked and she's taken this vow of silence, so she cannot defend herself. But now this sets up the response, that as people begin to attack her and say, how could you done such a horrible thing? It leads to the idea that the speech of God, the speech of the prophets, the speech of the righteous will emerge and defend her honor and her piety. So thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I'm so happy that my book now is available for pre-order. It should be coming out September 9th. I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast and to encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to it as well. You can email me, text me your feedback, your comments, your ideas, always looking for ways to enhance. And also, I encourage you to review the podcast. We have several reviews on our website, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And I would encourage you to visit my website and join my newsletter, where we'll be updated about my forthcoming book, my blogs, my research. I'll also be giving away some free books through my newsletter, so make sure to subscribe there. Thanks once again, and take care.